In the fall of 1886, a woman walked out of the Chiricahua country with a hole in her shoulder and a child on her back, and she stopped at the gate of a man who had every reason in the world to shoot her. He didn't shoot her. That's the whole of what he did. He didn't shoot her. He wasn't brave about it. He wasn't kind about it. He stood there in a hailstorm with a rifle sweating in his hands, and he could not make himself do the thing that every man he knew would have told him to do. 41 years later, that same country was surviving the worst drought in its recorded history, and it was surviving because of water that no white man ever found. There's a tank on the Arizona map today. Cattle drink from it. 2 towns take from it. There's a bronze plaque bolted to the spillway with a rancher's name stamped into it, and folks who drive past it think they know who to thank. They're wrong. They've been wrong for 100 years. This is the story of the woman who asked for shelter and left behind the greatest legacy the frontier had ever seen. The hail started before I saw her, and I have never once been able to separate the two things in my memory. Hail on the roof of the spring house. Hail bouncing off the water trough like somebody was throwing gravel at it out of pure spite. And then a shape at the gate, standing there, not calling out, not moving, just standing, taking it on the top of her head. I want to be clear about what I felt, because it wasn't anything good. I was afraid, straight through. My hands went to the rifle before my mind went anywhere at all, and the rifle came up, and I stood in the door of my own house with the wind pushing rain into my kitchen, and I aimed at a woman standing in my gate. She didn't put her hands up, she didn't run, she let me point the gun at her. I have thought about that a great deal since. I've thought about it more than I've thought about my own wedding day, God forgive me. Because the thing about somebody who won't run is that it takes the running out of you too. If she had bolted, I'd have fired. I know it the way I know the taste of alkali water. I'd have fired, and I'd have told the story at Boyd's place with my chest out, and I'd have been a man in this county for the rest of my life. She stood there, so I stood there. The hail quit. It quits fast out here, like it's embarrassed. And in the quiet after, with the whole draw steaming and the creosote smelling the way it only smells when it's beaten half to death by water, I heard the sound that changed my life. A child coughing. My name is Roy Meacham. In September of 1886, I was 34 years old. I had 211 head of cattle by my own count, and I kept a tally book because I don't trust my head to hold anything. I still don't. Everything of value I have ever known has come to me through the medium of a pencil. That book, I have it here on the table, and the leather has gone the color of an old saddle. That book has entries in it that read like this. Sep 4 wind, no rain while pulling sand, 211 H'd. Sep 5 nothing, 211 H'd. Sep 6 nothing. That's what a man's soul looks like when you write it down. A great deal of nothing, and a number that doesn't change. I had a wife once, Cora. She died in the spring of '84 of something the doctor in Wilcox called a fever and everybody else called bad luck, and after that I stopped keeping the entries she used to keep. She wrote the weather down as if it were a person. The wind came around and sulked all afternoon, that sort of thing, and I went back to numbers. I told myself numbers were honest. That's a lie a man tells when he's afraid of adjectives. I'm making an excuse for myself. I recognize it as I write it. What I'm trying to say is that when a woman came to my gate in the hail, my house had been silent for 2 years and 4 months, and I had gotten so used to the silence that I had begun to think of it as company. She came up the path when I lowered the rifle, not before. She waited until it was down. Now she was Apache. I knew that from 40 feet the way you know a hawk from a buzzard by the way it sits the wind. She wore a cotton skirt that had been blue once and a man's shirt, and moccasins that came up to her knees, and her hair was cut off short and ragged at the jaw, which I did not understand then, and understood too well later. Nobody had told me yet that the Chiricahua cut their hair for mourning. I only thought she'd done it for the traveling. On her back in a wrap of blanket was a boy of maybe 2 years, maybe 3. He had his fist in the wool at her collarbone, and he was coughing in that wet, cornered way that means a child is in trouble. She stopped 10 feet short of my porch. She looked at the door of my house, not at me. Then she looked at me, and she said one word in English. Shelter. That was it, not please, not help. Just the noun laid down on the ground between us like a stone. I said, there's soldiers all over this country. She didn't answer. I said, do you understand me? Cavalry, Fort Bowie. They're picking up every one of your people they can find and putting them on trains. She looked at me a while longer. Her mouth moved a little one corner, and I could not for the life of me tell you if it was contempt or exhaustion or the beginning of some sentence she decided wasn't worth the trouble. Then she turned her shoulder toward me, deliberate as a man showing you a bill of sale, and I saw the hole. Somebody had shot her through the meat above the shoulder blade. Front to back or back to front, I never asked. The blood had dried black and then the hail had wetted again, and it had run down her arm and dried a second time in streaks, and there was fresh red at the center of it, wet. And around the wound the skin was tight and shiny and the color of a bruised plum. She had walked. I found out later how far. She had walked with that and with a sick child on her back, and she had gone past. I counted them afterward on my fingers, lying awake. She had gone past at least 4 ranches to get to mine. Why here, I said. And she said in perfectly clear English, with an accent I couldn't place and never could, because you have no wife. I did not know what to do with that. I have not known what to do with that for 41 years. I stepped back from the door. Sep 8, rain, 2 persons at the house. That's what I wrote. That's all I wrote, and I want you to understand that I sat at that table for 10 minutes with the pencil in my hand trying to think how to put it so that if the book were ever read, it would say nothing. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the chair by the stove with the rifle across my knees like a fool in a dime novel, and she lay on Cora's bed with the boy tucked into the crook of her good arm, and every 20 minutes or so he'd cough and she'd shift and hum something low in her throat, 3 notes going down, just 3, over and over. I hear it now if the house gets quiet enough. Around 2 in the morning, she said, out of the dark, "You are watching me." "Yes." "Watch the door instead." I laughed. God help me. I laughed out loud in my own kitchen at 2 in the morning with a rifle on my knees, and it was the first noise of that kind that room had heard since Cora, and it sounded so strange to me that I stopped in the middle of it. Here is what I learned over the next 11 days, and I learned it the way you learn anything from a person who has no reason to trust you, sideways and slow, and mostly by watching. Her name, I never got it right. I asked her on the 3rd day and she said it, and I wrote it in the tally book as Ishke. She looked at what I'd written, upside down, and something happened in her face and she said, "No." So I tried again, Ishke, no. A 3rd time. She stopped correcting me. She just watched me spell it wrong and let me, and I understand now that she was being polite, and that being polite about it was the loneliest thing she did in my house. There are 7 spellings in that book. Not one of them is her name. The boy's name I could say because it was short. She said it and I heard Beck, and that was near enough that she let it stand. He was her sister's. Her sister was dead. Her sister's husband was dead. Her own husband was dead, and I never learned where or how, and her own child, she told me this on the 9th night, sitting on the floor with her back against the wall because she would not sleep on Cora's bed once she could stand. Her own child had died in July in the mountains of nothing, of not eating. She said it in English, and she used the word nothing, and she looked at the stove while she said it. That's when I understood the hair. She was 30, maybe. She could take a splinter out of a boy's foot with a needle and her thumbnail, which was split down the middle, an old injury. And she was forever picking at it when she thought, and she could do it while the boy screamed and thrashed, and she would not raise her voice 1 inch. She folded every cloth in my house into thirds, every one. Dish rags, the boy's blanket, the strips she used on her own shoulder. Thirds always. When I gave her a bandage folded in half, she unfolded it and did it over. I never asked why. Some things you don't get to have. Her shoulder went bad on the 5th day. I want to describe this properly because people hear the frontier and they think of gunfights, and the truth is that the frontier was mostly a smell. The wound started to smell sweet. There's no other word. Sweet, like a windfall apple gone over. She knew before I did. She sat down on the step at midday, which she had never once done, and she said, "Roy." First time she used my name. "You have whiskey." "I have whiskey." "And a knife you have not used for meat." "I had a razor." I brought it and the whiskey, and I brought a strap of leather off a bridle, and she looked at that and shook her head. So I put it away, and I have never forgotten that either, that she would not bite down, that she was not going to give me that. I opened her shoulder on the step of my house at 2 in the afternoon in the yellow light with the flies coming, and she made no sound. None. Her whole body went rigid as a stump, and her hands closed on the boards until the split thumbnail tore and bled. And I dug in there with the razor and a boiled needle, and my hands shaking so bad I had to stop twice. And the thing that came out of her was a piece of her own shirt, driven in by the bullet, no bigger than my little fingernail, gray and stinking. She looked at it in my palm. She said something in her own language, 3 or 4 words, flat and hard. Then she said in English, "My sister's husband did this." I did not understand. "He shot you." "He was carrying me," she said. "He fell. The rifle was on his back." She reached over with her good hand and took the piece of cloth out of my palm and turned it over like a man turning a coin. It went through him first. I sat down on the step next to her. We stayed there for I don't know how long. The flies came and we let them. And after a while she put the scrap of cloth in the little pouch she wore at her belt, and I stood up and went and got a bucket and washed the step, and neither one of us ever mentioned it again. Now I have to tell you about the water, because everything that matters comes from the water. My well was dying. It had been dying since June. It pulled sand, and then it pulled sand and a little gray water, and by the middle of September I was hauling from the Boyd's tank 3 miles east with a wagon and 2 barrels, and Harlan Boyd was charging me for it, which was his right, and grinning while he did it, which was also his right, though I have never forgiven him for it, and he's been dead 9 years. 211 head. You cannot haul water for 211 head. What you do is you sell them at whatever the buyer says, and then you sell the ground, and then you go to Tucson, and you do something with your hands for another man for the rest of your life. That was the arithmetic. I had done that arithmetic maybe 400 times in the book in pencil, and rubbed it out and done it again. On the 11th day, she was standing at the corral fence watching me pull sand up out of the ground. She said, "How much time?" I said 30 days, maybe less. She was quiet a long while. Beck was in the dust by the trough, hammering a horseshoe nail into the ground with a rock, absolutely absorbed, the way a child gets. The windmill turned about a quarter of the way and stuck and turned again. She said, "You know Rattlesnake Canyon." "I know it." "No," she said, "you don't. I want to be honest here, and honesty is expensive." When she said she could show me water, my very first thought, the very first thing that moved in me, before gratitude, before hope, was, she is trying to buy her way out of trouble. I thought, she knows the soldiers are coming, and she's got something to trade, and she's trading it. And the second thought, right behind it, coming up fast the way a mean dog comes up out of the brush, was, if she shows me, I don't need her anymore. I looked at that thought. I looked at it the way you look at something you've stepped in. I stood there at my dying well with my hand on the pump handle, and I understood at 34 years of age that I was a man who had that in him. It hadn't come from anywhere. It had been there the whole time, sitting in me quiet, waiting for the day it could be of use. I have never told anybody that. I'm telling it now because I'm old, and because there's a plaque on that spillway with my name on it, and because a man doesn't get to have a legacy and a lie both. We went up on the 16th of September. She rode Cora's mare, which she had not asked to ride and which I saddled for her without saying anything about whose it was, and I don't know if she knew, and I think she did. Beck rode in front of her. He'd stopped coughing by then. He'd started following me around the corral in the mornings, at a distance of about 6 feet, exactly 6 feet, like a piece of string tied us together, and when I turned around he'd stop and look off at the mountains as if he had business there. Rattlesnake Canyon is not a canyon. It's a joke somebody made in 1871 and it stuck. It's a wash with sides, dry as a bone, chalk white, and every man in that country had ridden up it, and every man had ridden back down and said nothing up there. She took us up 2 miles. Then she turned the mare into a side cut so narrow my knee scraped, and we went up that for a half-mile of pure grinding switchback, and then it opened out and it was still nothing. White rock, dead Ocotillo, a slope of talus running up to a rimrock about 90 feet high and no more shade than a wagon sheet. She got down. She walked to the base of the talus and she stood there and put her hand flat on the rock, and she stood so long that Beck got bored and started throwing pebbles at a stump. Then she said, "Here, under." I said, "There's no seep, there's no green, there's not a cottonwood in 10 miles, there's not so much as a—" "Sit down," she said. I sat down. "Now be quiet." I was quiet. And after about 4 minutes, with the wind gone, with even the boy gone still, because the boy could read her better than I could, I heard it. It was so faint I thought it was my own blood. It was under the rock, under about 30 feet of talus, and it was moving. I sat down there in the white dust of Rattlesnake Canyon, and I listened to water running underneath the driest ground in the territory, and I put my face in my hands, and I was not a young man, and I had buried a wife, and I cried like a child in front of a woman I'd pointed a rifle at 11 days before. She didn't touch me. She didn't say anything comforting. She walked 20 feet off and turned her back and gave me the only thing she had to give, which was the room to do it. When I got up, she was scratching a line in the dirt with a stick. "You will dig here," she said. "Not there where you want to. There it goes into the rock and it will break your back. Here," she drew a second line, "and a wall here across. When the summer rains come they will fill it behind the wall. The water below will feed it in the dry." I said, "How do you know this?" And she looked at me the way you look at a man who's asked you how you know your own mother's face. "My grandmother's mother watered horses here," she said, "before your grandmother's mother was born." We came down out of the canyon in the long light, Beck asleep against her, mouth open. I had the whole thing built in my head already. I'm ashamed of how fast, the cut, the wall, the pipe, the tank, the 211 head going to 400, the buyers coming to me. I was already a rich man riding down that wash. I was already writing it in the book. She said, "You will not tell Boyd." "No." "You will not tell anyone." "No." "Roy," she waited until I turned in the saddle. Her face in that light was all bone and shadow, and her cut hair moved in the wind. "When they come for me, you will not tell them I showed you." I said, "Nobody is coming for you." I said it easy. I said it the way you say a thing you have not once let yourself examine. She turned back to the trail. We came around the last bend of the wash, with the sun behind us, and our shadows running out ahead 30 feet long, and I saw the dust before I saw them. It was hanging over my place, a good column of it, red gold, lit up. 6 horses at my gate, a wagon, and a man in a blue coat standing on the step of my house, with his hand up shading his eyes, looking right up the wash at the 2 of us coming down out of the country where nothing was supposed to be. I heard her breath change behind me, just once, just the one breath. And then she said, very quietly, in a voice with nothing in it at all, "Take the boy." 2 syllables and one, and my whole life on the other side of them. Here is a thing nobody tells you about the moments that decide who you are. They do not feel large. They feel like a Tuesday. I was tired. My back hurt from the ride. I was thinking, in some low animal part of my brain, about whether there was still coffee. And a woman behind me on my dead wife's horse said, "Take the boy," and the sun was in my eyes, and the whole rest of my life stood up out of the dust and waited to see what I'd do. I said, "No, ride, go back up aisle. They have seen us. Then we'll." Roy, flat, not urgent. It was the not urgent that took the wind out of me. She had done this arithmetic already. She had done it hundreds of times, probably, lying in my house at night listening to me pretend to guard a door. She had done it before she ever came down out of the mountains. They have seen a man and a woman and a child. If they see a man and a child, that is a man and a child. So I turned my horse and I rode up alongside the mare, and she lifted that sleeping boy across. And he woke halfway and made a small complaining sound and settled against my chest. And he smelled like wood smoke and dust, and the particular sourness of a child who's been sick. And his fist came up and took hold of my shirt collar. 6 feet of string, and it pulled. She looked at me. Whatever it cost her to hand him over, she did not spend 1 cent of it on her face. She said, "Do not look back at me, not once, all the way down." Then she kicked Cora's mare and went past me at a hard trot, straight down the wash toward the soldiers, sitting up, hands loose, coming in plain as day like a woman who had been out gathering and had nothing on earth to hide. I rode down behind her with a child on my saddle and my eyes on the back of that mare, and I did not look at her. I have kept a great many promises in my life. That is the only one I regret. The lieutenant's name was Prout. He was 26 years old, from Ohio, and he had a list. Everything about that season in that country came down to lists. Geronimo had surrendered on the 4th of the month, down in Skeleton Canyon, and the army was cleaning up. That was the word they used, cleaning up. What it meant was that they were putting the Chiricahua on trains at Hallbrook and Bowie Station. Everyone, the ones who'd fought, the ones who'd never fought, the scouts who tracked Geronimo for the army, all of them, 400 and some souls, and sending them to Florida, to a fort in the ocean. People from the Dragoon Mountains, sent to a swamp. They didn't tell us that part in the papers. The papers said removal, and everybody in Wilcox drank to it. Prout was polite. I'll give him that and no more. He took his hat off in my yard. He said there'd been a report of stragglers moving north through the Sulphur Springs Valley, and he asked had I seen anything. And behind him the troopers were watering their horses at my trough, my sand water, and one of them spat it out. And she was standing not 20 feet away holding the bridle of Cora's mare with her head down. He had the list in his hand. It had names on it. Real names spelled the way the scouts had told them, and I stood there with a child on my hip and I thought, she is not on that list. Nobody wrote her down. If I say nothing, she does not exist. And Prout said pleasantly, "Your woman there, she's Chiricahua." I said, "She's my housekeeper." He said, "Since when?" And I said, and it came out of me smooth as cream, and God knows where it came from because I have never been a quick man, since my wife died, 2 years and 4 months. He looked at me, he looked at her, he looked at the boy. He said, "And him." I felt Beck's fist tighten on my collar. I heard the windmill catch and turn. I heard a trooper laughing at something at the trough, and I heard myself say, "He's mine." Understand what I did. I did not save her by that. I want that clear, because for about 10 years I let people around Wilcox believe a thing that was more comfortable, and I have spent the 30 since correcting it, and it doesn't take. What I did was, I claimed a Chiricahua child in front of a United States officer, and made him choose between his list and his supper. Prout stood in my yard a long time, long enough that his sergeant came up and stood at his elbow and said, "Sir," in the tone that means, "Sir, we both know." And Prout turned that list over in his hands, and I watched his face, and this is what I saw. He was not a cruel man. He was a tired one, and he had been ordered to gather everybody, and there was no line on the paper for a woman who wasn't on it and a child who might be anybody's, and it was 90 miles back to Bowie. He said, "The boy is yours." Not a question. A door held open about 4 inches. And I said yes. He nodded. He put the list in his coat. He said, "The woman comes with us." She was already walking toward the wagon. That's the part that broke me, and it broke me right there, standing in my own yard in the last of the daylight. She didn't wait to be told. She had the bridle in her hand, and she walked over and she handed the reins of Cora's mare to a trooper, and she got up into that wagon by herself, one-handed, favoring the shoulder I had cut open on my step 11 days before, and she sat down on the boards with her back straight. She did not look at me. She had told me not to look at her, and she did not look at me, and I have thought about whether that was mercy or discipline, or whether by then there was any difference left between the two. Beck started screaming. He was 2, maybe 3. He had no politics. He had no understanding of the Chiricahua removal or the surrender at Skeleton Canyon or Lieutenant Pruitt's supper. He knew that the woman who had carried him 140 miles with a bullet hole in her was sitting in a wagon, and he lunged for her so hard he nearly went out of my arms, and I caught him around the middle and he fought me. He fought me with everything in him. He hit me in the mouth with the back of his head, and he tore my shirt, and he screamed her name, her real name, the one I never learned to say, and I heard it then, clear, in a child's voice, and I could not hold it in my mind for even 1 hour afterward. It went through me and out. And she sat in that wagon with her back straight and her hands in her lap, and she did not turn around. Pruitt said something to me, I don't know what. They rode out. I stood in the yard holding a screaming child until the dust settled and the light went and the child stopped screaming and started shaking, and then he stopped shaking, and then he went asleep against my neck, the way a thing goes to sleep when there is nothing left in it, and I carried him inside and I sat down at the table in the dark. There was a bandage on the table, folded in thirds. Sep 16, clear soldiers. I wrote 3 words in that book that night, and I could not write a 4th. I have looked at that page 10,000 times. 3 words and beneath them nothing, and then the next entry is October the 2nd and it says, started digging. I dug for 4 years. Not steady. A man alone with a boy and 200 head does not dig steady. I dug in winter when the cattle were shifting for themselves, and I dug in the hour before dawn and the hour after supper, and I hauled that talus in a mule cart, 1 load at a time up a switchback so tight the mule wore the hair off both sides of his ribs. I hit water in the 2nd spring at 19 feet where she said, not where I wanted to. I built the wall the 3rd year. Out of stone I quarried off the rimrock, and it fell down. I built it again the 4th year, twice as thick, keyed into the bedrock the way she'd drawn it in the dust with a stick, and the summer rains came in August of 1890, and I stood on that wall in the rain with Beck beside me. He was 7. He was up to my belt buckle. He had a piece of string he was always tying and untying always, a habit I could not break him of, and eventually stopped wanting to, and we watched the whole of Rattlesnake Canyon come down that wash brown and roaring and stop, and rise and fill. 60 acre-feet. Boyd rode up when he heard. He looked at that water a long while and he said, how in hell did you know? And I said, I listened. He thought I was being smart with him. He never spoke a civil word to me again, which suited me. I wrote to the War Department in November of 1886, and in March of 87, and in 88 twice, and 89. And after that I lost the habit of hopping and picked up the habit of writing anyway, which is a different thing and gets you further. I wrote to Fort Marion, St. Augustine, Florida. I wrote to Mount Vernon Barracks, Alabama. When I learned they'd been moved there, I described her, a woman of about 30, gunshot through the left shoulder, healed, a split right thumbnail, hair cut at the jaw. I did not have her name. I sent them 7 spellings. 7 wrong spellings on army letterhead in my hand, and I can only imagine what the clerk who received that made of it, and I hope he laughed, because it deserved laughing at. I know now what those years were. I know that of the 498 Chiricahua sent east, more than 100 died of tuberculosis. mostly in the wet, and that they took the children away to Carlisle in Pennsylvania and cut their hair, and buried a good many of them there too, under stones with their names spelled wrong. I have a folder of replies, 19 letters over 11 years. Everyone says in different words the same thing, no record. She had told me the truth in my yard and I hadn't understood it. Nobody wrote her down. She did not exist. She had made herself into nothing so that a boy could be a something. And the army obliged her, and so did history, and so, for a while, did I. Roy Meacham was a hell of a man. He learned to read at 9 and read everything in the house twice. He got sent home from the school in Wilcox in 1897 for putting a boy named Ferris through a window, and when I asked him what Ferris had said, he wouldn't tell me, and he never did tell me, not once in his life, and I knew. He ran the tank. That was his from the time he was 12. He understood water the way I understood a ledger. He built the second wall in 1904 and the pipe down to the flat, and when the drought of 1904-05 killed 40% of the cattle in Cochise County, I did not lose one head, and neither did 4 neighbors I let onto it, and one of them was Boyd. He took Boyd's water, he drank it and said thank you. In 1911, the county came to us about running a line to Wilcox in the dry months. Beck did the talking. He was 30 by then, quiet, with his mother's sisters straight back and his fingers always at a bit of string, and he said yes on one condition, and they said name it. He said, the tank gets her name. And the man from the county said, very reasonably, the way reasonable men say the worst things, well, son, what is it? Beck looked at me, and I stood in that room, 60 years old, with the tally book in my coat pocket that had 7 wrong spellings in it, and I could not give my son his mother's name. They called it Meacham Tank. There is a bronze plaque on the spillway. The county put it up in 1923 with some ceremony. It has my name on it and the date the wall was finished and a line about the pioneer spirit of Cochise County. 900 people take water off that system now. 2 towns. It has not gone dry, not in the great drought, not ever, because there is water under that rock that has been moving there since before the Spanish, and a woman's grandmother's mother watered horses there, and she told me where to dig, and she told me not to dig where I wanted to. Beck went out to Oklahoma in 1913, when they let the Chiricahua leave Fort Sill at last, and he found 4 old people who had known her. 4. He wrote down what they told him and he came back with it in his coat, and he sat at that table and read it to me, and I am not going to put it here. I'll say only this. She lived 19 years after they took her from my yard. She was a nurse in the camp hospital in Alabama through the worst of the tuberculosis, and by every account she was the last thing a great many people saw, and she folded every cloth she used into thirds, and nobody living knew why. She never married again. She never had another child. And when they asked her, once in Alabama, whether she had any family, she said, and this is what the old woman told Beck. This is the sentence he carried across 2 states in his coat pocket. She said, I have a son who is safe. I am 75 years old. My hands shake and it takes me a morning to write what once took 10 minutes, and I've got no business doing this except that Beck asked me to, and Beck has never asked me for anything. I went up to the tank last week. He drove me in the truck. It was full good rains, and there were cattle standing in the shallows and a heron of all things, 90 miles from any water it had a right to know about. I got out my tally book. It's the same one. I've never needed another. That's a joke about my life that only I find funny. I turned to the back page, where 41 years ago I wrote her name 7 times and got it wrong 7 times, and I looked at those 7 lines of pencil for a long while, and the wind came around the rimrock the way it does. I've been telling this wrong. I said at the start that I didn't shoot her, and that I wasn't brave about it and wasn't kind about it, and that's true. But I've had a long time to think about what was on the other side of that gate in the hail, and it wasn't a woman asking a man for shelter. She looked at 4 ranches before mine. She looked at them and rode past. She wasn't asking for anything. She was choosing where to leave him. Beck's boy is 9. He came up to the truck while I was sitting there with the book open, and he leaned on the door and looked at the water and asked me what I was doing. I said I was trying to remember something. He said, "Is it a name?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, say it out loud. That's how I do it."